There is a version of you that most people have never met, not because you hid it from them, but because you spent years making sure they never had a reason to see it. You were patient when you should have been firm. You explained yourself when you should have walked away. You stayed in rooms that were slowly suffocating you because leaving felt like failure, and you told yourself that was love, that was loyalty, that was strength. It wasn't. What you were actually doing was building a debt that your nervous system was keeping track of even when your mind refused to. And one day, without a dramatic scene, without a final speech, without any of the closure you thought you needed, something inside you changed. Not loudly, quietly, the way a light goes out in an empty room. And the person who once fought to keep everything together suddenly stopped fighting. Not from weakness, from a kind of exhaustion so deep it had crossed into something else entirely. This is the psychological transformation that nobody is warning people about. Stay with me, because what you're about to understand changes how you see yourself, how you see others, and what you choose to do with that awareness. Most people think emotional sensitivity is a feeling, a personality trait, something that makes you cry at movies and feel other people's pain. And yes, that's part of it, but that is the surface description. Underneath that, at the neurological level, something far more powerful is happening. When you have a highly attuned nervous system, you are not just feeling more, you are detecting more. Think of it like radar. Most people are operating with standard civilian radar. They pick up what's directly in front of them, what's obvious, what someone is saying out loud. But some people are running military-grade systems. They're tracking what isn't being said. They're reading body language before the conversation starts. They notice when someone's words and their energy are moving in opposite directions. They hear hesitation underneath confidence. They sense resentment underneath a smile. They walk into a room and the emotional atmosphere hits them before a single word is spoken. And here's what makes this remarkable and terrifying at the same time. These people usually say nothing about what they notice. Not because they don't see it, because they do. They see it completely. They've seen it for a long time. But they made a decision, consciously or not, to wait, to observe, to give the benefit of the doubt, to see if the pattern corrects itself before calling it out. That patience is not a gift. That patience is a loaded gun. Because here's what happens inside a highly sensitive person over time. Every emotional violation they absorb but don't address gets stored. Not metaphorically stored, neurologically stored. The brain catalogs emotional data the same way it catalogs physical danger. It takes notes. It builds files. And those files don't delete themselves just because you choose to forgive. There's a psychological concept called emotional residue. When you experience a negative emotional event, betrayal, manipulation, repeated disrespect, and you don't process it fully, it leaves a residue, like smoke after a fire. The fire is out, but the smell stays. And each new incident adds another layer, another layer, another layer, until the air in that relationship becomes almost impossible to breathe. And you kept breathing it anyway, because you believed you could handle it, because you saw the good in that person, because leaving felt like giving up. But your nervous system was making a different calculation. Now let's talk about the moment nobody sees coming. There is a threshold in human psychology beyond which the emotional math stops working. Researchers call this the depletion point. It's the place where the brain shifts its primary directive from connection to survival. And when a highly sensitive person hits that point, the change is not gradual. It is sudden, it is complete, and it almost never reverses. The outside world sees this as coldness, as cruelty, as the sensitive person finally showing their true colors. But that framing is completely backwards. What they're actually watching is someone's nervous system execute an emergency protocol, the emotional equivalent of a circuit breaker. The system was overloaded, something had to shut down, and what shut down was the part of them that kept choosing other people over themselves. Here's something that will make the people closest to you profoundly uncomfortable if they've ever been on the receiving end of this shift. When a highly sensitive person reaches their depletion point, they don't get angry. Anger requires ongoing emotional investment. Anger means you still care enough to fight. Anger contains hope inside it, even when it doesn't feel that way. What happens instead is silence. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say. The silence of someone who has already said everything that needed to be said, dozens of times, in dozens of ways, in dozens of conversations, and was never truly heard. That silence sounds like peace from the outside. It sounds like indifference. And that is exactly what makes it so devastating to the people who created it. Because they expected one more explanation, one more chance, one more conversation where the emotionally attuned person would carry the emotional weight of both people in the room. And instead, they got nothing. A door closing so quietly they almost missed it. And by the time they realized it was closed, the lock had already turned. I want you to understand something deeply about why this happens, because this is where most conversations about emotional sensitivity stop, and they should not stop here. The reason highly sensitive people absorb so much before they react is not weakness. It is a profound, almost obsessive belief that people can change. They see the potential in others more clearly than they see the pattern. They are looking at who someone could be, while the evidence of who someone actually is keeps piling up around them. This is both their greatest strength and their greatest vulnerability, because the same perceptiveness that allows them to see the good in damaged people also allows them to rationalize staying in situations long after every psychological signal is screaming to leave. They explain away manipulation because they understand the fear that drives it. They excuse emotional unavailability because they recognize the wound beneath it. They tolerate dishonesty because they can see the shame underneath the lie. And in doing all of this, they become complicit in their own depletion. Not because they are weak, because they are too generous with their insight. But here is where the transformation gets interesting. Because there comes a point, and you will know exactly what I mean when I say this, there comes a point where the explanation stops working. Where you look at the pattern clearly one more time, and the compassion you once felt toward it has been quietly replaced by something cooler, cleaner, more final. Not hatred, not even anger, just a complete withdrawal of emotional energy from that direction. And in that moment, something shifts permanently. The person who once saw potential in everyone begins seeing probability instead. Not what someone could theoretically become, what they have actually consistently demonstrated they are. And that distinction, potential versus probability, is one of the most important psychological shifts a human being can make. Because it moves you from emotional idealism to emotional realism. And emotional realism does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop pretending. Now I want to tell you about the part that makes people deeply uncomfortable. Because everything I've described so far sounds noble. The patient person finally protecting themselves. The sensitive soul learning its own limits. The emotional genius finally trusting its own data. And yes, all of that is true. But there is a darker chapter inside this story that most people refuse to look at directly. When a highly sensitive person has been pushed far enough and has finally decided to protect themselves, and when the pain they've carried goes unprocessed, unexamined, unhealed, they become capable of something that surprises even themselves. Not violence, not cruelty in the obvious sense, something more subtle and in many ways more powerful. They develop the ability to see people completely, and then to say nothing. They can identify your deepest insecurities in the first conversation. They can recognize when your confidence is performance. They can hear what you're not saying more clearly than what you are saying. And now, instead of using that awareness with compassion, they use it as a wall, a moat, a kind of psychological fortress that almost nobody knows how to breach. And the people who once relied on their emotional openness, who were comfortable because the sensitive person kept carrying the weight, those people suddenly find themselves in unfamiliar territory. Because the person they thought they understood has become completely illegible to them. That is the shadow side that no conversation goes far enough to explain. Because here's the uncomfortable psychological truth. A wounded empath in survival mode is one of the most difficult people to reach on the planet. Not because they're broken, but because they're protected in ways that most people simply cannot penetrate. Their awareness of emotional manipulation makes guilt trips ineffective. Their familiarity with pity makes false vulnerability transparent. Their pattern recognition makes inconsistency immediately obvious. And their willingness to detach, once they've decided to, makes emotional games completely pointless. They have essentially graduated from the emotional dynamics that once controlled them. And now they're operating in a frequency that most people around them cannot access. This would be a beautiful story if it ended there. The sensitive person, finally free, finally protected, finally operating from clarity. But this is the part where we have to be completely honest with each other. Because protection is not the same as healing, and clarity is not the same as peace. And being impossible to manipulate does not automatically mean you're free from the wounds that made you that way. There is a version of the highly sensitive person who closes themselves off and calls it evolution, who calls their emotional distance wisdom, who calls their inability to trust discernment. Who has decided, based on the evidence of past pain, that people are fundamentally not worth the risk, and lives from that conclusion permanently. And from the outside, this person looks strong, looks calm, looks like they've figured it out. But what's actually happening inside is something very different. They are not at peace. They are at war, with their own need for connection, with the part of them that still believes in people even after all the evidence, with the grief they've never fully allowed themselves to feel, because feeling it would mean admitting how much it hurt. Carl Jung wrote that we don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light. We become enlightened by making the darkness conscious, by looking directly at the shadow, not to become it, but to understand it, to integrate it, to stop being controlled by it. A highly sensitive person who has not done this work doesn't escape their wound. They build their life around it. They mistake their defenses for their identity. They confuse the absence of pain with the presence of strength. And this is the difference that determines everything. The difference between a highly sensitive person who has survived and a highly sensitive person who has genuinely healed. The one who has survived is protected but not free. They've learned not to be hurt the same way twice, but they've also learned not to be truly open, not to be truly present, not to let anyone see the places inside them that still believe in something beautiful. The one who is healed is something else entirely. They are still perceptive, still attuned, still capable of reading rooms and detecting patterns and feeling more than most people around them. But they've added something critical to that awareness: discernment without defensiveness, boundaries without coldness, the ability to see clearly and still choose connection selectively, intentionally, without self-betrayal. They stopped carrying people who refused to carry themselves. But they didn't stop caring. They just got very, very specific about where that care goes. And they stopped explaining themselves to people who had already demonstrated they weren't listening. But they didn't stop communicating. They just stopped repeating themselves. And they stopped forgiving behavior that kept repeating. But they didn't stop believing in growth. They just stopped pretending that belief alone would create it. This is the integration. The shadow acknowledged. The wound examined. The pain finally metabolized instead of stored. And what emerges from that process is the most complete version of an emotionally sensitive person that exists. Not someone who endures everything. Not someone who trusts no one. Someone who finally trusts themselves enough to tell the difference. There is a specific moment that almost every highly sensitive person can identify. A singular instant where they stopped performing emotional patience and started exercising actual psychological clarity. Not the moment they got angry, not the moment they exploded or confronted or finally said the thing they'd been holding back. Something much quieter than that. The moment they looked at someone they'd been working so hard to understand, to help, to reach, and felt nothing but clear. No anger, no sadness, no hope, no despair, just a calm, complete certainty. This person will not change, not because they can't, but because they don't want to enough. And that's okay. But I don't have to stand next to it anymore. That moment is not a failure. That moment is not cold. That moment is the entire journey compressed into a single breath. Every conversation they had, every boundary they attempted, every chance they gave, every disappointment they absorbed, all of it finally processed, finally understood, finally released. And what gets released with it is the most exhausting belief a sensitive person ever carries. The belief that if they just love someone enough, clearly enough, patiently enough, consistently enough, that person will eventually become safe to love. Some people will, many won't. And learning to tell the difference before you've given everything you have is not emotional cowardice. It is the most sophisticated form of self-knowledge that a human being can develop. So here's what I want you to take from everything we've covered. Your sensitivity is not the problem. It never was. The problem was the absence of a structure around it. Sensitivity without boundaries is a nervous system without a container. It spills everywhere. It absorbs everything. It gets used by people who never intended to give anything back. But sensitivity with discernment, sensitivity with self-respect, with clear-eyed pattern recognition, with the ability to love people and still choose peace over proximity, that is not a dark side. That is the fully realized version of the person you were always capable of becoming. The darkness that people fear in highly sensitive people isn't cruelty. It isn't coldness. It isn't vengeance. It's clarity. Because a clear, grounded, emotionally intelligent person cannot be confused, cannot be gaslit, cannot be made to doubt what they lived through, cannot be manipulated back into a dynamic they have consciously chosen to exit, cannot be convinced to perform patience they no longer feel. And that clarity, to the people who relied on your confusion, feels like a threat. Let it. Because the most dangerous thing you can become, to the people who needed you uncertain, is someone who finally knows exactly who they are. And the most powerful shift in all of this? It doesn't happen in a confrontation. It doesn't happen in a final conversation. It happens in a quiet moment, alone, after everything, when you realize you are not angry, you are not bitter, you are not broken. You are just done. And done, when chosen with full awareness, is the beginning of everything that actually matters.